Over the years, I've done hundreds of videos on Chinese porcelain and art, bronzes and jades, how to authenticate them, what's happening in the auction market and all that. And I thought it might be fun and interesting to do some videos on a deeper dive into different aspects of Chinese art and culture and how it affected the world and their place within the history of the world as far as their culture goes and things that have happened. Take a deep look. And one of them I thought would be a great place to start would be the subject of the Yuanmingyuan and the sacking of that palace and basically the robbery, what is arguably probably the largest robbery of art that's ever been done anywhere in history, by value and by quantity. It was a breathtaking event, and it took only 3 days. And there's a lot of misunderstandings about what happened and why the Summer Palace was sacked. And of course, it's all tied into the Opium Wars, which took place in China. There were 2 Opium Wars. We're going to talk about those a little bit. And we're going to talk about the culture and the events that what was going on at the time, how that happened. The Yuanmingyuan was also known as the Summer Palace. It was named the Summer Palace actually by Europeans. The Emperor of China referred to it only as the Yuanmingyuan, and it is beyond doubt, had the garden survived, it would be the greatest and certainly one of the wealthiest museums in the world because of what was in it. In the end, China became really victim to the largest wholesale theft of destruction of art, I think, in world history. And it was all tied to trade, greed, imperialism, and a whole lot of other things. We're going to get into them. The palace, I want to talk about the place first a little bit because it's an interesting place. It's fabulously interesting. The complex was originally built and ordered to be built by the Emperor Kangxi in 1709. He was one of the first big Qing emperor, very devoted to the arts. His empire was very successful financially, and he built this place for his son, the Emperor Yongchen, who would eventually be his son, the prince, who would eventually become the Emperor Yongchen. And he sited it at the location of an old garden that was built about 5 or 10 miles northwest of Beijing during the Ming Dynasty. And he called it because he went there, and then once it was built, he went there and he looked, and there was one particular garden that just blew him away. It was full of peonies, and he thought it was so fabulous. He called it the Garden of Perfect Brightness. And that was the name that he gave the whole place. He actually, the entrance, one of the pavilions at the Garden of Perfect Brightness, he actually wrote in his own hand those words in Chinese and hung it there because he was so pleased with how the place came out. And for more than a century, the 860, it was on a huge piece of land, 860 acres. The Yuanmingyuan was the part and full-time home to 6 Qing emperors. And that included Kangxi, Yongchen, Qinlong, Jiajing, Daoguang, Zhenfeng. And they all used it to greater or lesser degrees. The Yongchen and Qinlong emperors in particular made the Yuanmingyuan their home. And they conducted affairs of state there. They studied there. They brought their families there for special holidays and so forth. And they spent hundreds of days a year there. This wasn't just a part-time, like a weekend house to them. This became their home even more than the Imperial Palace, the Forbidden City, was in Beijing itself. They preferred it. It was beautiful, and it is 860 acres. It was massive. the gardens started out quite developed, and then when Yongchen came along and he became emperor in 1725 or so, he ordered that the gardens be expanded dramatically. There was a lot of one of the reasons they had gardens there, that this was an area that was particularly rich with lots of water. There were rivers and ponds and lakes everywhere, so they knew they could grow beautiful gardens because there was no shortage of water. That had a lot to do with it. But they also used the place in the winter, which is interesting. And eventually they introduced waterworks, and they created more lakes, and they dug out areas for streams and irrigation and lots of little ponds and so forth. But the Emperor Yongchen was the first emperor to take up real residence there. The Kangxi emperor went there fairly often, but the Yongchen emperor loved it, and he wanted to be there all the time. And he eventually just moved there, more or less. It was really quite a thing, and people were fine with it. And Yongchen died there eventually. And then the reign of his son, the Qianlong emperor, the Yuanmingyuan, increased again in size, adding more gardens, more pavilions, more building, more everything. And they kept expanding it and filling out the land masses around the lakes and ponds and rivers, and doing all kinds of things. At its peak, there were roughly 3,000 separate structures on the property, with a total floor space of a mind-boggling 160,000 kilometers squared of structural space. A lot of space. They went on from there. Qianlong was a fan of European architecture, and what he went on to do was he built these buildings on the place that were done in the European style. And between 1747 and 1783, with the assistance of Jesuit architects, in particular, one of the court favorites, Giuseppe Castiglione, worked with Chinese engineers to add on these European-looking buildings. And they were done in a specific area. And these pavilions and gardens were built in the northeast section. And it was known as Zhiyanglo. And these were built on a 26 hectare strip of land, 750 meters long by 70 meters wide. And among them was the famous building that's known as the Chinese Versailles. And it's that stone structure you've seen the ruins of so many times. And the largest palace was the Haiyan Tang, and it was called the Calm Sea Hall, a complex. It was very reminiscent of the Cour d'Honneur at Versailles. It contained 36 rooms. It was a big place. And these were big rooms. These weren't little rooms. These were huge rooms with winding marble staircases and marble balustrades. And they had glass windows, which was really something back then because they didn't typically use glass and windows in China at that time. And outside was a large fountain surrounded by a water clock. And it had that was the place that had the famous bronze zodiac head figures that were in the news a few years ago. One of them came up in France and was auctioned, and there was a big to-do about it because it was bid on by a Chinese bidder and he didn't pay for it. And it was a protest bid against this one zodiac head being in France. The Chinese government are trying to repatriate this stuff. And eventually they got it back. They did get it back. The president of Christie's ended up with it, and he sold it to them, or gave it to them, I should say. They didn't pay anything for it. But that was just, that one bronze head, to give you some idea, auctioned for about $40 million. And that was just one of 12 plus all the other stuff that was there. At any rate, the place ended up being a repository for an enormous amount of imperial art. Because the emperor spent so much time there, they would routinely, starting with Kangxi, Yongchen, Qianlong, would send things to the summer palace because they wanted to enjoy it. They knew they would be there more, so they had the stuff sent there. And this included bronzes, jades, imperial porcelains from the workshops at the palace, the enamel workshops in Beijing. They had scrolls sent up going back to the Sung dynasty, all kinds of stuff. They had it sent there, and it ended up being a total collection of about 1.5 million objects. The Qianlong Emperor, in particular, was the biggest pusher of getting art into this place. He was sending things there, by all accounts, on a weekly basis. He was having things sent from the palace to the summer palace. Whenever he was back in Beijing, they were always, shortly after he'd go home, within days things would be getting shipped up to the summer palace. And this included, there was a long list here, paintings, bronzes, calligraphy, snuff bottles, cloisonne, silks, textiles, decorative arts, antiquities of all kind, old bronzes, archaic bronzes, that kind of thing, precious minerals, precious gems, and rare books, furniture, and you name it, whatever the emperor had, a lot of it ended up there. And he also had special galleries built to exhibit his stuff there. There were he built a library, and for displaying stone tablets and books, and then a lot of the collection was scattered throughout the buildings for ceremonial use, including a fantastic amount of cloisonne, really something. And the interiors were adorned with, giant mirrors and chandeliers. There were thick silk rugs and wool carpets of the, imperial quality throughout all the buildings. Thrones, chairs, tables, couches were found in different buildings. Teak and red sandalwood, some inlaid with precious stones, some decorated with jade, ivory, and so forth. And the same was true in the emperor. The emperor had apartments, a complex of apartments there that was enormous, and the place was just filled with art, and they also sent over, because they had gotten so many interesting things from the Europeans that were the Jesuits in particular. It would always be bringing the emperor, especially Qianlong, brought him lots of gifts, and the emperor Yongchen. They would send those over there. So there were French clocks and French jewelry, watches, pocket watches, all kinds of interesting things that were just used as decorations. And it went on and on for over 100 years. And the other thing that it contained was a massive collection of early calligraphy. And in Chinese culture, calligraphy is one of the highest art forms there is. And there were just hundreds and thousands of scrolls of calligraphy that were over there, many of them done by the emperor himself. And as I said, thousands of unbelievable cloisonne examples, incense burners and so forth, using them in the halls and the temples and all that business. And then there was the empress's apartment. Okay, she had her own series of rooms, and when they say apartment, they're not talking about a few little rooms. These were big buildings, thousands and tens of thousands of square feet. And the empress's area where she was living was equally furnished all the way through with lacquer and jewelry and coral and all kinds of decorative stuff that would appeal to her. And then there's the library. The library had roughly 120,000 books in it, including a copy of the Siku Quanshu, which is the collected works of the treasures of China. And it's a very, very rare book, fantastically rare, and apparently that was destroyed during the looting. All right. But anyway, between October 7th and 9th of 1860, 3,500 to 4,000 soldiers from both France and Britain stole or destroyed 1.5 million objects. And basically it came down to anything they couldn't carry and to steal, basically. They just smashed and destroyed it. And then they returned a week and a half later and destroyed the entire complex of hundreds of buildings, and they set fires. They used explosives to blow up some of the stonework, and it just demolished the place. And how it began and what led to that is the most interesting story of all. All right. And you have to get an understanding before you go into it, what was going on at that time and how China looked at the world and how Europeans looked at the world. They were very different. China in the Ming Dynasty had been fairly adventurous at sea. They had built a huge number of ships called the Treasure Fleet in the 1400s, and these were massive ships. They were much bigger than anything the Europeans had. Some of them were 350 to 450 feet in length. They had over 100 of them, and then they had hundreds of small tender ships that were about half that size to a quarter that size to accompany them when they would go out. And they would travel through what to China was the known world at the time. They would go to India, West Africa, and China was remarkably seafaring for a number of years. And they would bring back treasures. They would bring tribute back. They would send gifts to foreign leaders and all this. And then around 1525, they turned inward. They shut off the outside world. And there's never been really a good explanation. There was never much written about it. They burned the ships on their docks. They let them rot. They let them sink, and they ended basically all seafaring exploration. They just ended it up, and ended it right there, and that was the end of it. Okay. And then China was firmly had become sort of xenophobic and turned inward, while the Europeans and the English, on the other hand, the French and the Dutch and so forth, the Portuguese, they were and had been very expansionist and colonialist around the world in their activities. A lot of it was driven by trade, and that divergent view clashed because the British came to China. They had gotten trading rights in China from the Portuguese hundreds of years earlier with the marriage of Charles II to the daughter of the King of Portugal. The Earl of Braganza. He became the King of Portugal. His daughter needed a husband. Prince Charles had just returned. Charles II had just come back to England to take over after Cromwell finally was run out of town. But England was broke, and they got trading rights as part of her dowry. And we're going to probably do a video on that too, because it's an interesting story. At any rate, in the decades leading up to the Open War, trade between China and the West was only permitted under the control of the Chinese in what was known as the Canton system. And this was something that had been established long before the 19th century. Around 1757, the Qianlong Emperor put down an edict that basically said foreign traders can only come here 5 months of the year. They can only trade in the port of Canton. They cannot go to other ports. They cannot travel into China. They can go to Canton, and they will work with a licensed, basically, Chinese merchant who will supply with them and get them all the supplies they need, sell them to them, get paid, and then send them on their way. The Chinese didn't want outsiders coming into China. And it's their country, so, this was how they had done it. And you're dealing with the Emperor of China, who is God on earth. So the Chinese understood it. They said, they all thought that was perfectly fine. And the British didn't. The British hated it. And they were constantly pushing to get more trading opportunities in China, to open up many more ports, not to limit it to 5 months, enable movement around within the country, and all kinds of freedoms the Chinese just couldn't, the emperor just couldn't cope with. The idea was completely crazy to him, and he wouldn't do it. And finally, in frustration, the British sent a fellow named George Macartney to Beijing in around 1793, I believe it was, to establish an embassy in Beijing, and this was unheard of, to go as sort of an emissary or an equal to talk to the emperor, to convince him that he must open up more ports for the British traders in particular. And it didn't go well. It didn't go well. And at this point, when the Emperor Qianlong was the effrontery to the emperor of this man coming here, who's not even a king, he's just some lackey, coming to him to ask him to basically change how China does everything, everything about the Confucian system, how China was complete. The government, the Chinese leader wanted complete autonomy. The British had no business telling them on what they should do, and he was really offended, and it turned into a bit of a dust-up, and the Emperor Qianlong got very fed up with all of it, and he wrote a letter to King George in England. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read an excerpt of it, and it paints a pretty good picture of what the atmosphere was in the late 18th century between China and England. And it went like this. This is Qianlong who had dictated this letter. And he says, yesterday your ambassador petitioned my ministers to memorialize me regarding your trade with China. In other words, explain what you want to do. But his proposal is not consistent with our dynastic usage and cannot be entertained. Hitherto, all European nations, including your own country's barbarian merchants. Now, barbarian was just a term they used. It wasn't as negative as it is today. It just meant, basically, it meant foreigners that we don't understand, have carried on their trade within our celestial empire at Canton. Such has been the procedure for many years, although our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its own borders. There is therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce. In other words, you need us, we don't need you. And the big problem was, of course, there was a trade deficit. China was selling huge amounts of stuff to Europeans and foreigners, spices, tea in particular, and other things, silks. Some porcelain and things like that, but it was really the consumables that they were after for the big money. And there was a complete trade imbalance, because you have to realize that at that time, China was around 65% of the world's gross domestic product. That's how much stuff was coming out of China by the end of the 18th century. Huge amounts of goods. There were hundreds of ships going in and out of there and bringing back things that everybody wanted, especially tea, into Europe. The tea thing was enormous. And by the end of the 18th century, the British were in trouble. They were running out of silver. They needed to sell something to the Chinese, to get something into the Chinese market that would get them to send some silver back to England. They had been trading cotton out of India, and eventually the Chinese found other sources for cotton, began making their own cotton. They didn't have to ship it in anymore, so that was cut off. And other than that, they didn't have much. So they struck on the idea of opium. And the reason is that opium had been known in China for several hundred years. They were in the literati class. Certain classes of people smoked opium as a sort of a pastime, and it was frowned upon officially, but they didn't do much about it because it wasn't a big problem. There was very little opium being shipped in, relatively speaking. It didn't upset trade. It didn't upset commerce. It didn't upset the fabric of Chinese culture. But the British thought, well, if we can get more of it in there and get a lot of people addicted, we'll get back an awful lot of silver. So in the end of the 18th century, they ramped up smuggling into China with opium, and this was all done through the British East India Company. And they would send their ships over they had opium factories in India operating already. There was some big ones in Patna and some other places. And they began bringing in the opium. And eventually people began getting pretty addicted to it, and it began to affect things, began to upset the apple cart economically. And the Emperor Qianlong had put out an edict back in the mid 18th century that he frowned upon opium, and he thought that people should not just be doing it and smoking it and so forth, because he knew about the harmful effects of it. And the British just ignored it. And this really outraged him. And then in 1800, the emperor put out an edict that just plain banned it. They couldn't, with strict punishments and so forth. And a few years later, his son, Jiaqing, put an edict out that if you got caught using opium, you would be beaten with 100 lashes, which basically meant that you were going to die by beating. And that didn't stop the British, but what they did do, British trading ships began hiring other ships, privateers, so to speak. So the British East India Company would bring the opium sort of out, meet up with other ships, and let them go do the dirty work. And then once those ships got near the Chinese coast, they would have these small boats that would come out and pick up the opium, and they were called dragon boats. And they would go in, deliver the opium, get the silver, bring it back, and so forth. And it's the way the drug business is, I guess. And by the 1830s, there were millions and millions and millions of Chinese opium addicts. And there are stories written about how in certain cities, if you walked down the street, all you could smell was opium burning because there were so many opium dens and there were so many people using it. And in less than 30 years, between 1810 and 1838, China increased the amount of opium they were taking in from about 4,500 boxes of it a year, containers, these were things used to ship them, to 40,000. So it was a tenfold income. And the Chinese were just consuming more and more opium, and the outflow of silver to pay for that also increased just about as much. From let's see, what was the numbers? From about 2 million ounces in the early 1800s to over 9 million ounces a decade later. In 1831, the Chinese emperor was so angry that they were still breaking the laws. It was obvious the stuff was still getting in. He decided to go a bit further. And what he did was he hired, he didn't hire him, he was a government official named Lin Zezhu, and he was sent by the emperor down to Canton and Guangdong and Guangzhou, down that area, to clean it up, like the new sheriff in town's coming to clean up the opium. And he went there and he let everybody know who he was. He had all the documents. He was the arm of the emperor. And he went down there, and they arrested, 1,600 or so opium dealers that were Chinese nationals. So a lot of them got executed. A lot of them were punished. And then they began seizing opium. And they seized opium from the British. They seized opium from the warehouses, and they dumped it all into the ocean. They destroyed a lot of it, and it was a real a big step. This was something the British were absolutely flabbergasted at. And before he did it, though, before he went that far, he thought he could reach out to the Queen of England, Queen Victoria, and implore her to help him clean up his country. And because he didn't really understand how the British viewed them, and when I'm going to read some of his letter, because it's a very interesting letter and probably one of the most important letters that's ever been written regarding China, even more important than the one that Qianlong sent. He sent this as a way to open up not only to get assistance, but to build the relationship between China and England. And he wrote this letter. I'm not going to read all of it. We're going to read some highlights from it because it's worth hearing. And he started out this way: His Majesty and Emperor comforts and cherishes foreigners as well as the Chinese. He loves all the people of the world without discrimination. And whenever profit is found, he wishes to share it with all men. Whenever harm appears, he likewise eliminates it on behalf of all mankind. His heart is in fact the heart of the whole universe. Now, you have to remember, he was the emperor. He was a living god. This is how he was viewed. I am pleased to learn that you, as the ruler of your honorable country, are thoroughly familiar with the principles of righteousness and are grateful for his favor of His Majesty the Emperor. And he has bestowed upon your subjects great opportunities. Because of this fact, the Celestial Empire, following its traditional policy of treating foreigners with kindness, has been doubly considerate towards the people from England, because the British for a long time really had favorable treatment here. You have traded in China for almost 200 years, and as a result, your country has become wealthy and prosperous, which is entirely true, because when the British East India Company was started, England was broke. you have to realize when Charles II was coronated in England upon his return, they were so poor they couldn't even put a robe around him. They actually used the palace drapes and fashioned them into something for Charles II to wear to his coronation. England was busted ass broke, as they say. At any rate, so the British had a history there, and they basically, a lot of their wealth at that point had only been due to the Chinese. And then he says, as this trade has lasted for a long time, there are bound to be unscrupulous as well as honest traders. Among the unscrupulous are those who bring opium into China to harm the Chinese. They succeed so well that this poison has spread far and wide in all the provinces. You, I hope, will certainly agree that people who pursue material gains to the great detriment and welfare of others can neither be tolerated by heaven nor endured by man. And then he goes on considerably more, explaining why, if you are benefiting from us and we are helping you become wealthy, why are you trying to kill our people, is basically. And he says, have they no conscience? I have heard that you strictly prohibit opium in your own country, indicating unmistakably that you know how harmful opium is. You do not wish opium to harm your own country, but you choose to bring that harm to other countries, such as China. Why? I have heard that you are a kind and compassionate monarch. I am sure that you will not do to others what you yourself do not desire. I have also heard that you have instructed every British ship that sails to Canton not to bring any prohibited goods to China. All right? And she did do that, but they were dancing around it by saying, well, we're not bringing it to China. These interlopers are, in other words, the people that they're paying to bring them in. So they basically sidestepped that by doing it. And there was a death sentence involved, of course. So, and then he finished up. The letter is much, much longer than this. It's a very long letter. And then he went on, and you can find it on the internet if you look it up. If the merchants of your honorable country wish to enjoy the trade with us on a permanent basis, you must fearfully observe our law by cutting off once and for all the supply of opium. Under no circumstances should they test our intention to enforce the law by deliberately violating it. You, as the ruler of your honorable country, should do your part to uncover the hidden and unmask the wicked. All right? And sadly, Queen Victoria never got that letter. It was sidetracked probably by somebody with the British East India Company, and they didn't want her to see it. And then it leaked out the way news does, and it ended up in the Sunday Times in England. And the British people were infuriated that the Chinese, well, not everybody, some people agreed with them, but for the most part, the people in power felt that what they were saying was so insulting, and who do these Chinese people think they are? Because this does get into racism a bit. There was this idea that the Chinese, no matter how rich they are and how much stuff they have, they're not quite as good as the Brits. And we have the British and the French and all this. They all believed they had a right to go anywhere in the world, and might makes right. And if we want to go to battle with you, we're going to go to battle with you and take your stuff. And this is sort of what was happening. And England declared war on China more or less on that basis, that they were going to civilize China and teach them about trade. All right, and they declared war in 1839 on the pretext that quantities of their heroin, which they were smuggling in, was confiscated and destroyed. It was like, you can't steal our drugs. And they were demanding reparations on top of it. They wanted the Chinese to repay it. And when Lin had the material destroyed, got rid of it all, when the vendors and dealers began complaining about their financial losses, because it was significant, it was millions of pounds of opium, he said, have the British government pay you for it. And he convinced them that the British government would pay them for it. And when the British government heard about it, they said, the heck we are. And they made that part of the deal, of the settlement at the end of the Opium War. And it became a big thing. And by the time it was over, and it was they had the Treaty of Nanjing, or the Treaty of Nanking, it was known. the opium trade, they agreed to taper off a little bit on the opium trade. They sort of, they didn't say they would, but they were trying to be flexible, but they wanted more ports. So they got increased ports to ship into. They were given some extra freedoms and so forth. And this really put a burr in the Chinese. They didn't like this deal at all, but they basically had a gun to their head because they'd had their ports robbed. The Chinese ships and the military was no competition for the British. The Chinese were still using flintlocks and bows and arrows, and their ships would go up against the British ships off the coast of China and just get demolished. They couldn't stand a chance. And that was the end of that second war. But it wasn't really all resolved. And the Chinese at this point felt like they were being forced into something they didn't want to do. There was a lot of cultural tensions going on. There were uprisings everywhere. The fabric of China was starting to come apart a little bit. And the emperor was putting up with not only the British and their opium coming into the country and weakening the culture, but they had all these political problems going on and uprisings in different parts of China. I won't go into them all. There were a number of them. So this was what was going on. And it went on for about a decade. The Chinese were dragging their feet about opening up the extra ports and approving trade and so forth. And the British still were unhappy, and they kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And then you had what became the Second Opium War, and it began over a couple of fairly trivial things. One of them was for the French who got involved at this point in the war. There was a Jesuit that was executed by the Chinese because he was breaking the law. He was proselytizing illegally in an area of China where they weren't supposed to be. He had been warned repeatedly, and finally they killed him. So the French said, you killed a Frenchman, that's it, we're going to war with you. And the Chinese seized a ship that was flying under a British flag, but it was called the Arrow. And the Arrow had been previously a pirate ship. And the Chinese saw the ship and realized that's that pirate ship. So they confiscated the pirate ship that was flying British flag, and they took the British flag down, and they arrested the crew of 12 people. 3 of the people on the crew that were taken into custody were actually pirates. They were Chinese guys, and they had been pirates, and they were wanted. Eventually, the Chinese let the Arrow go and let go the crew, except for the 3. But to the British, that's enough to go to war over. How dare you? So they did. And the Chinese began attacking. I'm not going to go through all this wars and cities and attacks, but they started attacking different ports. They were blowing up ships. They were moving up. They were sending, people to try to get the emperor to agree to things. The British were just massacring the Chinese, heading up the waterways, heading towards Beijing, to the point where they were just absolutely getting demolished, and they had nowhere to go. And finally, they got to the outskirts of Beijing, and they were going in to force the emperor to Shenfeng to agree to all of their demands. And their demands at this point were just massive. They had enormous amounts of stuff that they wanted. Dozens, over a dozen additional ports to be made. They wanted the Chinese to allow the Brits to go anywhere in the country they wanted. The Brits and British subjects could not be subject to any sort of criminal prosecution for any of their actions. On and on and on. And at that point, the emperor fled Beijing and went to another mountain retreat that he had. And the British at that point were chasing down Chinese soldiers. And then the Chinese sent, the British rather, and the French sent a delegation, they called it, to talk to the emperor or to whoever was in charge. There were about 39 people. By this point, you have to realize what was going on. So the Chinese had the British killing thousands of Chinese, sinking their ships, and now invading the imperial palace, coming up to Beijing, all in a front. And then they had the nerve to send a delegation to make a deal. And the Chinese at this point weren't having it. They took the delegation hostage. They killed some of them. Some of the people they tortured, which is true, they did torture them, but you don't know. You never heard there was never any record of what they said, what the delegation said that so infuriated the Chinese. But regardless, eventually the word got out that they had done this. And the British and French soldiers went to the Yuanmingyuan to I think that they thought the hostages were there or something. And by then there was really nobody there. The emperor was gone, and the place was left empty. And the Chinese and the French, the French and the English soldiers went in there to see the palace. They'd never seen it. They'd heard about it, but never been in it. And they got there and they still hadn't ratified their agreement to end the war yet. It was all on the table being negotiated with Prince Gong, because Zhen Feng was hiding up in the mountains. He didn't want to get killed, and they eventually got to the agreement. But in the meantime, the French and the British figured, well, we won this one, and they got to the Summer Palace on October 6, 1860. And when they first arrived at the French were the first soldiers to get there they were actually chasing the Chinese soldiers, but the Chinese soldiers went the other way, and the French troops just ended up at the Yuanmingyuan looking around going, wow, look at this place. And they didn't pursue the Chinese army anymore. They wanted to stay to look at this. And they did. And the British followed soon behind them. And at the time, French General Montauban and Lord Elgin, who is the son of the same Elgin family that raided the Parthenon and stole the Elgin marbles, as they're known now to Britain. They looted those, and a fellow named Hope Grant. And these were all military guys, and they went there and they toured the facilities and decided they were going to identify certain objects they were going to confiscate and take back as trophies for their big victory to the Queen of England and the Queen of France. And a lot of that stuff ended up at the Fontainebleau. So they went in and they began going through things and gathering up loot. And eventually the soldiers were allowed in, and then they began taking things. And then they began, grabbing things, and it became sort of a riot. And there are lots of stories and eyewitness accounts about how the soldiers, when they got to a room, they couldn't get the stuff out, or it wasn't something that they wanted. They just set fire to it or smashed it. All right, and they were shooting at chandeliers. There are paintings of Chinese English soldiers walking around and French soldiers walking around wearing Chinese robes and Chinese hats and all this sort of thing. And it was just sort of an absolute disaster all the way around. The rooms and halls, especially the emperor's bedroom, were just crammed with all kinds of stuff, and they went in there and were getting it. They found robes lined with furs, ermine and sable. They were pulling vases off of the shelves, jades, and all that kind of thing. And it was 4,000 soldiers were there. And they just cleaned the place out. Basically, they looted the place and cleaned it out in the course of about 2 days. And then when the word spread about what really happened to the emissaries, the 39 emissaries that were kidnapped and eventually some were released, but a number of them were killed. When the word got around about the ones that were killed and how they were treated, Lord Elgin, a few days later, went back in retaliation and ordered the complete destruction of the entire complex. Burn all the buildings, and there were several, hundreds and hundreds of buildings on the property, and take down all the stone structures, and just vandalize the place so it'll never be recognized again, which they did do. And within days of that, Prince Gong signed the final agreement, said, okay, you win, and it was just humiliated into this. And to the credit of France, they didn't have anything to do with the destruction. They did loot. They looted the place to death, but they didn't have anything to do with the fire and the total destruction of the complex itself. They felt that was immoral. That was a bridge too far for them. But at any rate, the fire lasted days, and in the end, there was nothing left but stone and junk on the ground. And Prince Gong, as I said, signed the treaty on October 24th. a couple of weeks after the looting and about 4 days after the place was sacked, when they destroyed everything. And for that, China was forced to pay 8 million taels of silver to the British to cover the cost of the war. In addition, they had to cede over the peninsula of Kowloon because the Chinese had already given up Hong Kong to them. Opium trade was legalized, and Christians were given full rights and access in all regions of the country, plus all these extra ports that were given in. So now China had been forced to legalize opium. The emperor was in humiliation and hiding. There was no money, and this was the beginning of the end. And the Chinese Empire collapsed within 45 or so years of it, the last emperor. But it was an absolute mess. And the French troops withdrew on November 1st, and there were lots of reports of how they had an auction in Beijing after with the soldiers, because it's how soldiers were paid back then. One of the ways they were compensated for their work was that any loot that they could steal after something, you got a percentage of it. You got a piece of it through auction or through some sort of payment plan. All right. At any rate, so today it's estimated that around 1.5 million objects were taken between the French and the British, and they're today in over 47 countries around the world and in about 2,000 museums. And to get your head into the value of how much this stuff probably was worth, you have to consider the sheer numbers. They're almost unimaginable. All right, and we've all watched, the auction scene, and we've seen what imperial porcelains bring. And you have to keep in mind that a lot of the imperial porcelains you see, and this is not something the big auction houses and so forth want to talk about, but a lot of the imperial porcelain you see on the market today was stolen from the Yuanmingyuan. That is where it came from. It's sort of the dirty little secret. It's where the Guimet got a lot of its stuff at their museum. The impact that this looting had globally was unbelievable, because you have to realize that most of the stuff that was in the Imperial Palace is now in the Chinese National Museum, and what isn't there is in Taiwan, because they took a whole bunch of stuff too. But the stuff that's on the market largely today, the dirty little secret is a lot of it was looted from the Yuanmingyuan, the major pieces. And here are some numbers to consider if you want to try to get an idea of value. All right, if 0.1% of the objects at the Imperial Palace were top quality imperial porcelains and so forth, okay, roughly the very, very best pieces, and we've seen it. These are the pieces that bring $20 million or more each. We've seen them. The Fujita collection, they had it was a 27 or 30 lot auction, and I think they averaged $10 million a lot in that sale. All right, so you have 1.1% of the 1.5 million objects that were stolen would be equal to about 1,500 objects. And if they're worth $20 million a piece each today, that's $30 billion in money. All right. And then if you go down to the next level, 0.5% of the objects taken were worth around 10 million a piece in today's money. And these aren't unrealistic numbers at all when you consider it. Would be about 75 billion. And then another 1% of the objects would be worth, about 1% would be worth about $1 million each. That's 15,000 objects, because the numbers are huge. Now, remember, the emperor had the best things sent to the summer palace. The best things. We've seen what the best things bring many times. Okay? So there you've got about $15 billion. And then if 2% of the objects are worth around, let's say, 400,000 each, all right, which isn't unusual at all today. That's the price of a good market period vase. That's $12 billion. And you run down the list. You got 4% of the objects. Let's say they're in the lower end. They're only worth $60,000 or $70,000 each. All right, those would amount to 60,000 objects with an average, with a price, a value of around $4.5 billion. Then you have like 10% of the objects. Let's say they're only worth $10,000 each. All right, out of the 1.5 million, that's 150,000 objects. worth 10,000 each. That's $1.5 billion right there. And then you have the remaining 82.4% of just odds and ends, and assuming that they're all probably worth, these are imperial goods, again, jewelry, pearl necklaces, jades, and all this, say they're worth 5,000 apiece. That's $6 billion. And in total, that comes out to $144 billion. And what it doesn't take into account is like what some of the scrolls are worth, what some of the calligraphy is worth, because there's no record of any of the calligraphy coming out of there. This is the thing that's really sad. The Emperor Qianlong, in particular, was a huge collector of calligraphy, and Kangxi too. But Qianlong brought calligraphy there. They had a huge library full of scrolls. They know that they were there, and those 120,000 books and all that material. Who knows what that is and how much that is worth? And included among the loot that they do know about is a set of books known as the 40 Scenes of the Yuanmingyuan. And they are today at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. They were stolen by a British officer, a French officer who brought them there. He sold them in France, and they ended up at the Bibliothèque. And this is a commissioned set of 40 paintings that Qianlong had done. And he appointed two particular court favorites to do them, were classic Chinese artists. One of them was Shen Yuan, and the other one is Teng Dai. And they did the landscapes, the 40 landscapes, and then he hired the calligrapher Wang Yudun to come and do the script in the upper corners. And those pictures, the colored pictures that we've been showing throughout the video here, those colored scenes, and those were all the different aspects and areas, the highlights of the Yuanmingyuan. And when you look at those, you start to get a sense of how big this place was and how much stuff there was. And if that album right there, if that album of 40 paintings were to go onto the market, if the Bibliothèque Nationale decided they wanted to sell it, it would probably bring on a par to what Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa is worth, or maybe The Last Supper. That's how valuable that series of paintings is. That's how valuable it is. It's one of the most important albums of paintings in the world. And it's sitting in the Bibliothèque Nationale, and it was stolen. And my view is that a lot of this stuff should have been sent back. A lot of the stuff should have been given back to the Chinese. They were blatantly preyed upon by the British and the French. They were lied to. They were attacked. There was no justification for the Opium Wars, and there was no justification for any of it. And it's a shameful bit of history, and there's a lot of history has shame in it. It's nothing new. But this is a part of history that doesn't ever seem to get any attention, and it often is spun with this idea that the Chinese somehow had it coming. No, they didn't. You went there. You know, the West went to China to do business. The West went to China to make money, and they were completely disrespectful to the Chinese people, completely disrespectful to the Chinese culture and the government and everything else. And in the end, it was only because they had the biggest cannons that they were able to get their way. And in the end, it certainly contributed to the collapse of China, and ended up with the Republic period, and eventually, it was taken over by the communists to put some order back in the country. It was so damaged, but it's a very long history, and it's a very interesting one, and that's my view of it. So, in my opinion, the sacking of the Yuanmingyuan was the largest robbery in the history of the world, to the tune of at least $140 billion, and maybe double that. No one will ever know. It's a shame. All right, but it's an interesting history, and I hope you enjoyed this. All right, thanks for watching. Subscribe, and if everybody likes this, we'll do another one. We'll work on more of these. They're very time-consuming to put together, but they're fun. I had a lot of fun doing this, and I hope you enjoyed it. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.